A few days ago, I made an updated Excalibur build and found that, well, let's just say he's pretty darn good since the update. But when I said Excalibur got buffed big time, I did not expect Baruuk to come around the corner with hundreds of millions of damage more. And that's right, in today's Warframe guide, we're gonna take a look at Baruuk, what has changed with the update, and of course, I have builds. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, well, let's jump right into it. But you know the drill, when it's about Warframe guides, the first thing we talk about is the kit, starting out with the passive, and this one I want to keep relatively short because it's mainly tied to his 4th ability, so I want to talk more about it when we get to that. For now, the only important thing here is that Baruuk has a special meter called Restraint, and to make it very simple, you want to keep the Restraint meter as low as possible all the time, because of reasons that we're going to get into when we talk about his 4th ability, but also when the meter is completely depleted, you get up to 50% damage reduction, which is very nice. Baruuk's 1st ability is called Elude, and this one is really cool. What it does is it gives you a 100% dodge chance, or in other words, attacks that would hit you just completely don't hit you. However, this only counts for attacks that are coming from the direction that Baruuk himself is looking at, not the camera, the model of the Warframe himself. Now, all in all, this sounds like a pretty good survivability tool, but one thing we gotta keep in mind is that this 100% dodge chance only counts as long as we are not attacking, so relying solely on Elude for your survivability is not recommended. The main use of this skill, in my opinion, is to keep your restraint meter as low as possible, because for every shot and every attack that you evade with this Elude skill, your restraint meter goes down by 1.2%, and especially if you have a lot of enemies with fully automatic weapons, this makes Elude a perfect tool to get that restraint meter down in no time, as you can also see in the background right here. Elude also has an augment called Elusive Retribution, and I personally really like this because what it does is, for every attack that Elude prevents from hitting you, you receive more melee attack speed as well as melee crit damage. This percentage here also scales with your ability strength, so at high strengths you can get a whole lot of attack speed and crit damage out of this, and I personally would recommend to try and make a mod slot free for this because it is really darn good, especially if you're typically the type of person who uses something like Arcane Strike on your Warframe to increase your melee attack speed. Then with Baruuk, I would strongly recommend to dump Arcane Strike and rather use this one. Ability number 2 goes by the name Lull, and this is also Baruuk's helmet ability in case you want to use it on other Warframes. What this does is relatively similar to Equinox's Rest and Rage, because when you cast it, you create an AoE around you where enemies, if they are in this AoE, slowly fall asleep, lose their alertness level, and they're opened up for finishes in this state. But not just that, also for every enemy that you put to sleep this way, you also reduce your restraint meter. Now, if you ask me, this is a very good crowd control, especially if you want to build into some sort of finisher playstyle, but for today's builds, we're not going to use this one, therefore I want to cut it a bit shorter here. Just one more thing to mention is, there is an augment called Endless Lullaby, and this is pretty much exactly what Common Frenzy for Equinox's Rest and Rage does, in that if you take out a lulled enemy with a finisher, then it will re-trigger the effect without having to recast it, and as a nice passive bonus on top, it also increases the lull duration. As I said, if you want to go into the sleeping finisher type of playstyle, then Endless Lullaby is a definite must-have, but I personally do not prefer it because we're taking enemies out so fast that there isn't really a point for me to put them to sleep first. Ability number 3 is called Desolate Hands, and this is our primary survivability tool. What it does is relatively similar to Nova's Null Star. It will surround you with a couple of floating particles, in Baruuk's case these are floating daggers, and for each dagger floating around you, you will get 10% damage reduction, capping out at a maximum of 9 daggers and therefore 90% damage reduction. However, similar to Nova's Null Stars, these daggers too seek out nearby enemies and home in towards them, so they will gradually decrease over time. However, the good thing here is, once a dagger hits an enemy, that enemy will be disarmed, meaning even though the dagger is not there anymore, the enemy will be unable to shoot you. Now, the amount of daggers that you get scales with your ability strength, so at high strength you can easily have over 20 daggers, which is good because that means you don't have to recast it all that often to keep your 90% damage reduction, since that caps out at 9, so you only need to refresh the daggers once they start to dip below 9. So yeah, long story short, you want to have this thing on for your 90% damage reduction and refresh it whenever your daggers start to go low. And finally, ability number 4, his big ultimate, his bread and butter, is called Serene Storm. This, similar to Excalibur, equips Baruuk with his Exalted melee weapon, which are Exalted Fists. First off, while this is on, Baruuk will gain damage reduction, scaling with ability strength, but capping out at 40%. And this is the reason why we have this whole restraint meter in the first place, while your Serene Storm is on, you will regenerate restraint, so the meter is gonna fill back up over time, and once the meter is completely full again, your Exalted weapon will deactivate. So that is also why I said having the meter down is very desirable, because if you keep the meter empty, that means your Exalted weapon will be up constantly. Now, when it comes to the stats of his Exalted weapon, we're gonna take a look at that in more detail in just a second here, but what it does have is a couple more interesting features in that, similar to Excalibur's Exalted Blade with the update, also Baruuk's energy waves increase your melee combo counter and can trigger Tennokai opportunities, and enemy projectiles that are hit by one of these energy waves mid-air will be redirected and fly back to where they came from. This is pretty cool because it means you can literally punch the bullets flying towards you out of the air. Now, Serene Storm also has an augment called Reactive Storm, and this is very much inspired by Chromatic Blade from Excalibur, because what it does here is also giving you a whole lot more status chance on your Exalted melee, scaling with ability strength, and it also makes it that the damage type of your Exalted weapon changes to whatever the enemy you're currently attacking is weak against. But as always, if you could maybe leave the video a quick like, that would be super duper helpful with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. Now, so much for Baruuk's abilities. Before we get into the builds though, let's take a closer look now at Desert Wind, his Exalted weapon, analyzing its stats and also talking about some shenanigans that are going on here is what I mean. First of all, Desert Wind has pretty darn impressive stats. We're looking at a base damage of 860, which by default is impact, but as I said, with the augment, it does change to whatever the enemy faction you're up against is weak against. And then we have a really nice crit performance with 35% crit chance at a 2x multiplier. And while the base status chance of only 15% is not all that impressive, we gotta remember, with the augment mod, we're getting a really big status chance bonus, meaning at somewhat decent ability strength, we're looking at easily 100 to 150% status chance on this. Now, this looks relatively normal, however it becomes a bit sus when we talk about arcanes, because with the recent update, just like all other Exalted weapons, also Desert Wind got an arcane slot, so we can use melee arcanes here, and naturally the first thing that came to mind for me would be using melee influence, just like I did on Excalibur, which was super darn strong, but as it turns out, it almost never procs and almost never spreads any type of element. Alright, Future Blacky here. I'm gonna cut out the whole rant that I had recorded originally, because guess which hotfix came in the minute I was recording the gameplay for this video? That's right, melee influence now works properly on Baruuk's Exalted weapon, it triggers properly, it spreads the elements properly as should be, and therefore melee influence is now, just like with Excalibur, probably the best choice for an arcane on his Exalted weapon, at least going for a light attack build. Just note that, due to the fact that most of the gameplay was already recorded, most of what you're gonna see throughout the video is without melee influence. Just what you're seeing right now in the background is a new recording after the hotfix, showing how the whole thing looks with melee influence on. Alright, builds. I, in this video, have two different builds prepared for you. One is focused on using your Exalted melee with the normal attacks, and the other one is the one that deals hundreds of millions of damage by going for a heavy slam attack playstyle. But how about we start out with the normal attack build? The first thing I want to talk about here would be the Archon shards. For this build, I would strongly recommend going for one or maybe even two yellow shards into more casting speed. The reason for that is that we want to keep our daggers from our third ability up to get the damage reduction from them, but since they, just like Nova's Null Stars, fly away towards enemies, that means we will have to recast them quite a bit, and more casting speed for me just made the whole thing way more convenient to play. And then the rest of the Archon shards, I went for the purple ones, giving us more melee crit damage, and if we have more than 500 maximum energy, this effect doubles, so with the 4 purples that I have here, we're looking at a total of plus 200% crit damage on our Exalted melee. Now, for the helmet ability, first of all, I would say you don't really need one if you don't want to go for one. Baruuk's kit itself is relatively good, but if you wanted to use a helmet ability, maybe Rhino's Roar, maybe Grendel's Nourish, maybe Wrathful Advance like I did, or whatever else you like, I personally found his second skill to be the most replaceable one, because in practical gameplay, I kinda ended up never using it. But of course, if you want to incorporate your 2 in your gameplay, then you could also go ahead and just replace his first or something. As for the build itself, the first thing we need to make sure is that we have at least 500 maximum energy, otherwise our purple Archon shards are only going to give us half the buff. So either go for normal or primed flow, both should be enough to get you to 500 energy, no matter if you're using Baruuk Prime or the normal version. Up next, we're going to use 2 augments. First of all, Reactive Storm to give the status chance buff and the damage adaptation to our Exalted melee. And secondly, I chose to go for Elusive Retribution, the augment for our first, that gives us more attack speed as well as even more crit damage. For the survivability, we are in a relatively good position already, with 90% damage reduction from our 3, 40% damage reduction from our 4, plus 50% damage reduction from the passive if our restraint meter is completely empty. So what I did here is I only went for Arcane Blessing to increase our maximum health, because that happens to be relatively low by default. And then I also went for Adaptation, though I would say Adaptation might be debatable with all the damage reduction that you're getting anyway. Treat this one as more of a suggestion rather than a must-have. One thing that is very important though is high ability strength, of course, because the more ability strength you have, the more damage your Exalted weapon deals, the more crit chance we're gonna get from our Wrathful Advance subzoom, and also more ability strength means more daggers surrounding us with our third ability, therefore we don't have to recast it all that often to maintain our 90% damage reduction. So we go for Umbral Intensify, Blind Rage, Power Drift in the Aura, as well as Mold Augmented. Finally, our energy economy is going to be saved by Equilibrium, and for the last mod slot I went for Prime Continuity, just to give us a bit more duration, because that makes our first skill way less energy hungry. This right here then would be the full build that I use for my normal attack playstyle. Now, due to the fact that the energy wave from your Exalted weapon is relatively big, you have multiple different options as to how to build this thing. Since the hotfix came as I was working on the video, this right here would be the melee influence build, going for pure electricity and damage over time. It's really darn strong, probably the best option that you could go for here. This right here would be the build for a different approach in case you want to go for melee vortex to pull the enemies together. It's also pretty nice, and what I didn't expect, also melee exposure, especially against enemies that are weak to corrosive, is a super duper nice damage boost that I enjoyed quite a bit, just to give you a couple of options. As for how to play this whole build in practice, this is actually relatively simple. Once the mission starts, you switch on your first ability and try to keep it on for the entire duration of the mission, because not only does it give you a little bit of protection when you're not attacking, but it is also really good at keeping your restraint all the way to the bottom. Up next, try to make sure to always have a decent amount of daggers from your third ability surrounding you for the 90% damage reduction. Use your helmet ability of choice in the second slot as you see fit, and then go for your Exalted melee and hack away at the enemies. As you can also see in the background, the damage that these things deal is absolutely mental. But alright, so much for the normal attack build. Let's also talk about the second build, which is focused on dealing hundreds of millions of damage with heavy slam attacks. First of all, the Archon shards are exactly the same. However, in the helmet ability, in this case, I would really recommend going for Wrathful Advance, because with the Archon shards, we're investing very heavily into our crit damage, therefore having high crit chance would be a great synergy, and since this is a heavy slam attack build, that means our melee combo counter is not going to go into the 12x anyway, so we can't get our crit chance from Blood Rush. Therefore, Wrathful Advance, in my opinion, is the best helmet option for this one. This right here then would be the heavy slam attack version of this Baruuk build. It's relatively similar to the normal attack version previously. Only difference here is that in the aura we use Ready Steel to increase our initial combo. That's going to be helpful with the heavy attacks. And then we use both Naira mods, Naira's Anguish as well as Naira's Hatred, because their mod set bonus also heavily increases slam attack damage, meaning these two are very important here. Now, technically there is a third Naira mod that is for whip weapons exclusively, and in the past what you could do is equip a whip onto Baruuk and put that Naira mod on it to use that whip as a sort of stat stick to get the 3x set bonus from the Naira set. However, unfortunately, with the recent update, those type of stat stick interactions got removed, meaning going forward, this whole whip stat stick thing on Baruuk is not gonna work any longer. As for your Exalted build on the slam attack build, I did try to work with melee influence here as well, but it seemed to me that it didn't really spread the elements when I performed the slam attack, so in this case, I personally would recommend going for melee exposure just to amp up the damage as high as possible to get the big damage numbers. This right here would be the build that I used for my slam gameplay in the background. And also here, when it comes to playing this in practice, it works exactly the same way as the previous build, only difference being that you're not using normal, but therefore heavy slam attacks. And as you can also see in the gameplay footage in the background, having red crits for hundreds of millions of damage is not even close to being a rare find. This build is incredibly strong and super duper fun to play. And in case you also want to see that aforementioned Broken Excalibur build, this you can find right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Lycon Shepherd, Onakanio 2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.